Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me on this live Black History Month event on the very 1st of October. I am here at Black Cultural Archives, and I'm looking forward to spending the next hour with you, going through an introduction to Black British history based on the collections that we have at Black Cultural Archives, and also sharing with you well, it's going to be, I'm trying to make it as interactive as possible. So there will be some questions as we go along. And then at the end, it will be how you can then engage further, how you can look at this material for yourselves and find out more. So really our aim or our whole vision at Black Cultural Archives is to be the home of Black British history. We do find, many of you may have found similar, that whenever Black history is discussed, the lens does tend to shift to the US in the sense that there's a lot more generally known about famous figures, famous African Americans, famous struggles of African Americans, and even literature as well. Children's literature, adult literature does tend to have a very US focus. Whereas here at Black Cultural Archives, we're very committed to telling the British story, and anyone or anything that has influence on Britain is what we're interested in. The next, sorry, just scroll on to the next slide. I seem to have lost my scrolling capabilities. Here we are. So this is a slide that when people come into our building and we do workshops, we show them these slides without the names on, actually, to indicate how much more, I guess, universally famous are certain faces there. So the face of Malcolm X, the face of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, people are always able to identify them instantly. And then the other 5 people, usually less so. Sometimes with prompting, people have heard of Claudia Jones and they will associate her with Notting Hill Carnival, or maybe with the West Indian Gazette, which was an early national Black newspaper. They may know Darcus Howe if they remember him from his TV show on BBC One, but he's obviously an activist. Well, they were all activists, really, but he's an activist, Trinidad-born, lived in Brixton for a while. So also if people have a connection to the local area, Brixton, where we're based, they may know of him. And the same with Olive Morris. She was also a local activist, a member of the Black women's movement, a member of the British Black Panthers. She passed away very young, but there is some memorialization in Brixton to her. And the other 2 people are less well known. Roy Hackett was one of the architects of the Bristol bus boycott. Again, in schools, they do learn a lot about the Montgomery bus boycott in the US, which of course Rosa Parks was connected to, because Black people weren't allowed on the buses. If they were on the bus, they had to get up if a white person came or move to the back. So that gets taught a lot in schools, but the Bristol bus boycott, not so much. And obviously we don't have that type of segregation here. So their boycott was more to do with employment and the rights of Black and Asian workers to be employed by the Bristol Bus Company. So that was what the boycott was about. And finally, Dr. Harold Moody. A lot of what we talk about is kind of post-Windrush, because a lot of the people that were involved in founding BCA were of that Windrush generation themselves. They either came from the Caribbean or their parents did. Though also we do have African and African-American voices in as well. But I always do like to remind people that activism didn't just start with the Windrush. So Dr. Harold Moody is an example of those who came to England. He came in the late 1920s and he studied medicine at King's College London, and then established a GP practice in Peckham. And then he also founded the League of Coloured Peoples, which was a very early civil rights organization. So I do like to remind people that there were people here before, and that though we do tend to talk a lot about the 20th century or mid to late 20th century, that's not the beginning of the story. So on that note, I want to move on to this slide. There's a bit of lag on my end, but hopefully you will be seeing, here it is. So the collections we have at Black Cultural Archives, you could kind of divide them into 2 types. We were established in 1981, and a lot of the material that came to us through those who were active in establishing us was material around their activism. So if they were active in the Black Power movement, that's the material that came to us. If they were active in like Black British feminism, that material came to us. So those are our really rich, meaty collections. And even with it in terms of the arts, if it's like Black dance or theatre, there's always kind of a strain of activism running through it. But the early founders of Black cultural archives were also interested in all types of Black history, whether it came from the African continent or the diaspora. And so from the very beginning, their hope was that Black cultural archives would be an archive and museum. And with that in mind, they also collected museum objects. We don't do that now because it was a very ambitious undertaking that they started with, to think we could be a museum and archive that contains absolutely everything to do with African people everywhere. So now we focus on the archives, on the British experience, but what you're seeing here is a snapshot of some of our eclectic mix of objects, which I've brought together because I think it really illustrates the length of history that we're talking about when we're talking about African people or African descended people in Britain. So I wanted to just post a question, actually, which you can type in the chat, which is what you think or know to be the oldest item of these 5 items here. So you could either type coin, pins, photograph, bust, or bronze into the chat, and then we can see. So when people are in the building, we actually bring these objects out so they can actually, handle them to an extent. We don't let people obviously pass the coin around, but they can come up and see the physical objects. They can look at the photographs, and then they arrange that, and that helps us to then have a conversation about the length of recorded history that there's been an African presence in Britain. So I'm just going to check on the comments to see if anybody has commented. But if not, perhaps Andrea in the background, if you're able to read out anything that anybody's written, because I'm not actually seeing it. Okay, so there's no comments yet. So I could just tell you then that, well, I can give a clue, and then if there's still no comments, I can just talk you through it. But the oldest item there actually dates from the year 208 AD. So this is I'm actually going to give it away now. It's the Roman period. And that's the reason that Roman coin that you're seeing there is the oldest item in our collection. It's actually really tiny. It's just a little bit smaller than a halfpenny piece, for anyone who remembers what a halfpenny looked like. And it depicts the head of the Emperor Septimus Severus. So when the Romans invaded, one of their areas of settlement was York. And when that site was excavated, they found skeletons belonging to African men, but also Septimus Severus himself was African on his father's side. So he's an example of the length of recorded history that there has been an African presence in Britain. We don't have huge classical collections at BCA at all. So for us, that's really more of a kind of symbolic point to make to people. I know when I did Latin at school, there was no sense of the Roman Empire and the countries that it covered. The pictures were only of Italians. And obviously the clue is in the word empire. It seems obvious to us now. And the same issues come when we come to talk about the British Empire, really understanding what empire was and how many different nations were included in it. So that's the oldest item. The second oldest item is the bronze head at the bottom. This is part of what's known as a Benin bronze collection. So you may have heard a lot about them. It's been in the news a lot recently as the calls to repatriate looted items have intensified. So many organizations have started to return these bronzes, which were captured in the 19th century, to Benin state. They used to decorate the palace of the Oba of Benin, which is now in present-day Nigeria. Ours is a replica, I hasten to add. It's not actually from that looted hoard because they still manufacture them for the tourist market. So it's one of those items that our founders would have perhaps seen in a shop and thought, that's really beautiful, let's buy that for the collection. But I use it to illustrate again, a time period, because it's from around the 1400s that Europeans first visited Benin State and, excuse me, saw this type of bronze casting being done, and they were very surprised. They didn't know that Africans could do bronze casting. And it's also from the 1400s that we start to see communities of African people coming to Britain in different ways. One way was through, well, with Henry VIII, for example. I mean, the only thing I've learned about Henry VIII was that he had 6 wives. That's probably a lot what most of us still learn today. But his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, came from Spain, and the Catholics had just recently reconquered Spain. So anybody who was Jewish or Muslim was either forcibly converted or expelled. And in the household of Catherine of Aragon was one African woman, also known as Catherine, who then became part of her household. And so historians can surmise that through that route, there could have been others. And also in the court of King Henry VIII was a trumpeter by the name of John Blank. Normally, when we see Africans depicted in historical portraiture, they are just sort of nameless figures on the periphery. The purpose of them being included is to magnify the magnificence of the main sitter. But in the case of John Blank, that's not the case. He appears alongside other trumpeters and musicians. And the reason we even know his name is because a letter exists to this day, I believe it's in the National Archives, that where he's asking King Henry VIII for a pay rise. So that tells you straight away he was a person of some confidence, because Henry VIII was kind of scary. I don't know if he got his pay rise, but it's significant that he had the agency to do that. And again, I don't think these people are one-offs or anomalies, because by the time Queen Elizabeth I comes into power, she issues an edict to say that African people must be expelled from England. She thought there were too many. Now, we don't know what too many looked like. We're not too sure what the population was. But what I think is more interesting than that is that nobody paid any attention. Apparently, people were not expelled. Nobody left. They just went about their daily business. So maybe the Queen thought, that's not going to work, so forget about it. But of course, it's also the age of exploration, where she sends out ships to different countries. So people start to be enslaved and brought into Britain that way. In the late 1700s, the American War of Independence happens, where the British said to the enslaved African Americans, fight for us, we guarantee your freedom, you can come and live in England on a nice war pension and live happily ever after. Well, Britain lost for a start. Secondly, when they did come here, because they said, well, we fulfilled our end of the bargain, here we are now in Britain, can we have our war pension? The response was, oh, sorry, there's no money. But they still continued to live here, but swelling the ranks of the poor. And as there were more men than women, they tended to intermarry in the local population. So they're not visible as a distinct community of people nowadays. And then others came because they came to attend boarding school. African rulers would send their sons here to be educated. And other people just came as freed people. So they'd freed themselves from enslavement and came here, or they came as free people. So large numbers of people living, especially in the cities in the 18th century in Britain. So that one bronze statue there enabled me to talk about like 300 years of history. And then we can skip to the third oldest, which covers, I brought out to illustrate the Victorian period. You may recognize the bust of Mary Seacole there, who was a contemporary of Florence Nightingale. Nowadays, there's a lot more known about her than when I was at school. And I think that's largely due to the efforts of one of our founders, who was herself a medical secretary during World War II, and she was from Jamaica. And she wanted to make sure that women's war service is remembered alongside men. And it was through her research for that she discovered Mary Seacole. And she said, how is it I've been working in medicine for 20 years and have never heard of her? So now she is on the curriculum. And I think what does tend to happen, unfortunately, is in the wider kind of discourses, Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole do get played off against one another, not for the best of motives, I think. But I always say, as a friend said to me, there are so many famous men in the medical field. Why can't we have two women and celebrate them equally? So Mary Seacole, for those who don't know, went over to the Crimea during the Crimean War, and she helped a lot of soldiers there. She did it by herself because she was refused permission to go with the War Office, to go with Florence Nightingale and the other nurses. She went by herself. She didn't care. She set up a business there. And then when she returned to London, where she settled after the war, very highly acclaimed, known as Mother Seacole. You can see on the bust that she's wearing medals. And it's really only after her death that she kind of fell out of history, because Victorians really, I guess, sentimentalized the story of Florence Nightingale. And Mary Seacole just did not fit that picture, because she was an independent widow who traveled the world. She doesn't, just wasn't the image that they were looking for. But fortunately, she was rescued from, as we call it, the dustbins of history, thankfully, again, to some of those early founder members and stakeholders. The photograph then, for me, represents the Edwardian period. He is Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who was a really famous classical music composer, born in South London, in Croydon, South Norwood area, in 1875. And he died prematurely in 1812, as a lot of composers did tend to die young, and they didn't tend to make much money from their work, but he was incredibly famous, and others became rich from him. Again, from about the 1950s, his music seemed to have fallen out of fashion, but much more recently, we're seeing a huge resurgence of interest in him from local history groups, from all of the different conservatoires, and a lot of them where he actually held teaching positions. So really interesting man. And we have the second biggest collection of his works in the UK, outside the Royal College of Music. And those collections came to us through independent historians based in Croydon, who thought BCA would be the best place to deposit this material. But we shouldn't, I'm quite keen that we shouldn't think of these people again as being like one-offs, because I think it's just that they've become the most famous. So the obituaries I read for Samuel Coleridge Taylor described him as the most noteworthy. They described him often as the Negro composer, but the fact that they said he's the most noteworthy then tells you that there are others, they just haven't reached his fame. And we know, looking back through the 18th century, all the way back to, say, John Blanke in Tudor times, there have been African people composing music. It's just we need the scholars to come and unearth these stories. So the final item there is relating to the 20th century. Finally, we come to the 20th century, where this is really just, we're looking at the period just prior to the arrival of the Windrush Generation after World War II. So these are military cap badges standing for the King's African Rifles and the West Indian Regiment, which to me point to the way in which I think world wars are not, or certainly were not when I was at school, taught properly. I think if you teach history, British history, as though it's always just been the British Isles, you get a really narrow view of history. But if you teach it as being the British Isles that becomes a British Empire in which about a quarter of the world's people are living, and then you bring it back to what it is now, then so many rich stories can come into it. So World War I, it's not commonly known that it started and ended on the African continent, because of course the European powers were fighting over each other's colonies. And it's not commonly known that it ended on the African continent 2 weeks after the official armistice, because the German commander hadn't heard of the surrender, so we're still fighting alongside 9,000 African troops. So a very different story of World War I. And then the same with World War II. I don't remember learning about, I definitely did not learn about African or Caribbean troops being, fighting with the Allied forces, or World War II being experienced in the Caribbean in terms of blackouts and rations and German U-boats being present in the Caribbean Sea with a constant threat of invasion. None of that was really learnt about, or the fact that there were thousands of Caribbean people served in the Royal Air Force in particular, because Bomber Command had just been established, so they needed people to come in. The other armed forces were a bit more reticent about taking in, people of different races. And even going back to World War I, when they eventually had to accept people of African descent because they needed troops, they didn't allow them to shoot at the Germans because they didn't want Black people shooting at white people, even though it was the enemy, because that might give them ideas, I guess. And then after the war, upset their ideas of racial hierarchy, which is what the empire depended on. So this is just like, a background. I've kind of whizzed through 2,000 years of Black British history in one slide, but I think it's kind of important to get that background before we delve into the more 20th century collections, which, as I said before, are more to do with the activism of the generation that came here after World War II, and then realized that, they weren't just going to be able to make money quickly and go back. They came up against a lot of challenges. So for a lot of people, they ended up making Britain their home. And for that reason said, we need to campaign. We need to campaign for our rights. We need to campaign to make this a more equitable society. So this is a snapshot here of some of the organizations that they formed based on. So we're talking about the 1960s here. So members of the Black Power groups in the US, people such as Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King at some point were all here in Britain, visited Britain during the 1960s, which influenced the communities here to form themselves into these organizations such as the British Black Panthers, which was modeled quite loosely, I'd say, on the US Black Panthers. The difference being that we don't have weapons, we don't have guns in this country. So they didn't come under, like the Panthers in the US came under intense criticism for their belief in their right to arm themselves and defend themselves. So that wasn't an issue here. And all of these groups tended to be broadly Marxist in their basis. So in addition to racial equality, they were also committed to working class self-determination. And therefore the Panthers, for example, as they progressed and as the leadership changed, became a lot more racially collaborative. So, for example, where they heard that there was maybe a group of white workers striking at a particular place, they might go and join that strike. If there were Asian workers campaigning for something else, they would go and join with them. And then they'd have their own sessions amongst themselves where they would teach and learn about African history and so on. Other groups like the Black Liberation Front, they were a lot more focused on the African continent and less about racial collaboration, because for them, true Marxism was to be found in traditional African communities, not in the USSR. And therefore, they were really keen on African people regaining their culture in terms of language, traditions, and so on. So their newspapers, which we have almost a full collection of here, are a great resource for almost every political event or political anti-imperialist event that's happening or struggle throughout the world. And then they also talk about Nigerian recipes and Ghanaian baby names because they want to bring the culture in so much. Their leader wasn't literally lynched, Tony Suarez. He was just arrested and jailed and accused of being an IRA sympathizer. So that's one of the ways in which the authorities did try to kind of disperse these movements by removing the leadership where possible. The third picture there is of a later organization. So the Black Power movement in the UK was relatively short-lived, but it did influence a lot of other groups. One of them being the Organization of Women of Asian and African Descent, which was founded by Olive Morris, who you might remember from the first slide, Gerlin Bean, and Stella Dadsey. So three women who wanted to really give Asian and African women a voice, not so much give them a voice, because there were many local groups of Black women. And when I say Black, I mean Black in the term of the way that the word was used at the time. It was called political Blackness. So it really meant all people of color, so to speak. They said there's all these things going on in different neighborhoods. There's a Manchester Black Women's Cooperative. There's Haringey Black Women's Group. There's Southall Black Sisters. Why don't we have a conference in Brixton where we can bring all these women together just so they can kind of share ideas, really decide what does feminism mean to us as Black women? What are the areas that unite us? What are the areas of challenge? Where are the differences? And originally it was called Organization of Women of Africa and African Descent, as you can see at the very top of the poster. But then Asian women came forward and explained the types of discrimination that they were facing, some similar, some different. And so they joined the movement, but because they couldn't afford to reprint all of their materials. Some of their newsletters, they've just crossed out Africa and written Asian in and copied that. But together they campaign, as I said, as Black women. And a lot of the material we have is of the Black women's movement. In fact, I'd say the most popular collections are collections to do with Black women's organizing and feminism, though I use the term loosely because some of the Black women didn't define themselves as feminists. They defined themselves in different ways. But really fascinating collection if you ever get the chance to come to BCA and look at that material for yourself. But we also do have some online exhibitions. But one thing we can say is that all of these organizations had 5 to 6 key areas of campaigning. And this slide here shows you two things. One is an example of their newsletter. So OWAD's newsletter was called FOAD, and they had a different cover each month. But I like this particular one because you can see just the range of different topics they were involved in. So racism, inflation, alcoholism, violence, all types of issues that didn't necessarily only specifically affect Black women. They affected Black men and they affected the whole of society. So it was great to see Black women taking these issues forward. But overall, we could say it's health, policing, education, work and housing, and immigration as well, actually. So again, when we get university students in for workshops, I usually hand them on their tables something to do with each of these campaigns, and they get to look through different types of material and then share back with the group comments about what they found and the differences in tone and language from the different types of publications. But what I've got for you today is a snapshot of just 3, health, policing and education, which include clips of our oral histories, because we have huge oral history collections. I don't off the top of my head know how many, but I know we've got at least 50 recordings of women from the Black women's movement. And if I don't want to get these figures wrong, our archivist would really need to be here to tell us that. So one of the campaigns being health, and one of the main areas that they campaigned around was sickle cell. And we have a short oral history for you of Dame Elizabeth Anyonwu, who's Emeritus Professor of Nursing, I believe, at the University of West London. I hope I've got that right. And she's going to explain to us what the sickle cell campaign was. Andrea is going to play for us now.
The campaign to get newborns screened. That's, you see, I haven't got a good memory of all of this, but that will explain how I work closely with Black women's groups up and down the country, actually.
Oh, I think a bit of that. Could you play that again, Andrea? I think the beginning may have cut.
Health, it affects men and women, but it has illness places a particular burden on women. And so, for example, sickle cell disease, it was the mothers who were caring for the children on the whole. And there were women who were affected by the condition as well. And there were men, obviously, but the impact on Black women was particularly high, and particularly also maternity and the whole issue of screening and pregnancy for those affected by the condition, and then the campaign to get newborns screened. That's, you see, I haven't got a good memory of all of this, but that will explain how I work closely with Black women's groups up and down the country, actually.
Yeah, so sickle cell was a big campaign because at the time there wasn't much understanding around it and there wasn't much research into it. So a lot of people were dying needlessly from having the wrong information from medical professionals, and just there not being adequate treatments for it. So, but one thing she did say there was that the campaign to get newborn babies screened for the condition. So I tend to look at these campaigns in terms of the success. I think what they've actually managed to achieve is phenomenal, because newborn babies now are all screened for sickle cell disease, and a Sickle Cell Society is doing great work in just raising awareness. And while it's still perhaps less funded than other areas of health, it's becoming increasingly, there have been some experimental treatments and just more knowledge. Like back in the days, I've had people tell me that the doctor would just look at them and be like, well, you're not black, so you can't possibly have sickle cell. But now we know how ridiculous that is. You can't just look at a person, decide their skin color and say, oh, well, you don't have that, or so on, or decide that, well, there used to be an erroneous belief that you're immune from a malaria if you have sickle cell disease. Couldn't be further from the truth. So fortunately, those kind of misconceptions are dying out. There is another health campaign which was very big at the time, and you can see there's a picture of a syringe and it says ban the jab. The ban the jab campaign was around the use of Depo-Provera as a contraceptive injection. So this particular contraceptive was banned in the US. So the Black women here were wondering, well, if it's banned there, why is it being used here? And how it appeared to be being given without informed consent, and sometimes without any consent at all, largely to Black and Asian women. So they were just trying to make the community aware that if you do go for any kind of vaccines, particularly for rubella, make sure you're only getting one shot, because if you get two shots, it's likely you were given the Depo-Provera without your permission. And if unmarried women gave birth in hospital, they were often given this jab. So they were trying to raise awareness around that, and also around the side effects of it, because that wasn't really being talked about. So it did all feel very experimental. And they also talked about, access to abortion and women's reproductive rights. Again, still very current issues to this day, but I would hope that all of us have at least that empowerment of agency. You don't go to the doctor and expect them just to tell you what you have to have. You have a voice now, which would have felt more of an uphill struggle for women in those days. And moving on to the next slide, I'm going to show you, which is going to be about policing. So policing and criminal justice, this is, a lot of you may have heard of the Brixton uprisings of 1981, which did spread nationally. And that's the same year that Black Cultural Archives was founded, in a way to have a more positive representation of Black history in Britain. But what was the issue? Why did things come to a head in 1981? Why did the community and the police clash in such a devastating way? Well, the reason really is the Sus law, which G. Bernard is going to explain in an oral history in just a moment. So G. Bernard, the late G. Bernard, was Croydon's first Black councillor. So let's hear what she has to say about this thing called Sus.
My first assignment was to establish West Indian parents against Sus. I don't know if you're old enough to know what Sus was.
I wasn't around when it was put into place, but I do. I mean, when the actual policy was still existent, I was just about born. I was born in the mid-80s.
Oh,
so I
you
was
come long after.
Yeah.
Well,
79,
Sus was a vagrant hack that was made in something like 1836 round there. And then when Black people, it used to be used on the Irish, and then when Black people come to Britain, they start to use it on Black people. So most of our young people who have a criminal record, most of our young men who today end up with a criminal record, came out of Sus, because you didn't have to do nothing beside walking down the street and a policeman lock you up, take you to court, charge you for Sus. Where is the evidence that this young man or woman was about to commit a crime or has committed a crime? He don't have to have no evidence. It was the heart of racism to destroy our young people.
Yeah, so she explained that it was it was based on the Vagrant Act. It was actually the Act of 1824, which is really to pick up people who are seen as loitering or up to no good. And as she said, it used to be used on Irish communities that first came to Britain, and then they used it on Black communities. The way it differs to, like, a lot of people will say, well, that's just stop and search. We have that now, nothing's changed. The main difference was that when police arrested somebody under the Sus law, they didn't have to have evidence and they didn't have to have any witness. They arrest the person on suspicion. So you're being arrested on suspicion of having the intention to commit a crime. And then you're charged with sus, tried in a magistrate's court where you only need one police witness to convict the person. And they are convicted of sus and face up to a year in jail and a criminal record. So you cannot defend yourself against a sus conviction. One solicitor I spoke to recently, a retired solicitor, said, when we defended young men for sus, we already had our appeal statements ready because we knew that the person was going to be convicted. And 80% of sus convictions were of black men and boys, which then, I guess, inflated the crime statistics, giving the police the justification to continue with very heavy-handed policing in areas like Brixton. So you see how it was kind of being stoked up. The cause of it was really the legal system itself, and that was causing more police arrests, and it was just going round and round. So in 1981, people just had enough, and it kind of exploded into violence on the streets, which also happened in all the major cities of England. And in fact, it had happened the year before in Bristol, but Bristol doesn't seem to attract the stigma that Brixton does on account of the uprisings. But I always do say, if more people understood what the uprising was about, I think they would feel differently about Brixton, because I think the tabloid media did spread this around the country as being, thugs and violence and mindless. So that was really what was presented to people. And interestingly, we do collect tabloid newspapers as well. So when we have school children come in for their English language workshops, we show them the different types of newspaper and get them to really analyze the language and think about the audiences of these different newspapers. That leaflet there is from our collection. It was actually from one of the trade unions' national conference, and it's Rock Against Racism, which people have been talking about again recently, maybe reviving something like that, having music to unite communities against racism. And as I say, what did come out? I have to end on a positive for each campaign. I mean, by November, the sus law was abolished, thanks in large part to the Brixton Defence Campaign, which was a loose coalition of different activist groups who got together to form a response to the government inquiry. And so by November, sus law was gone. So that was something beneficial. And the final one I wanted to talk about is education, because this really points to our whole reason for being. And that's another cover there of one of the OWAD newsletters where they're talking about education. Let's listen here to what G. Bernard had to say about education campaigns.
And the most important part of all this for me was to ensure that I understand the British education system so that I could fight to get children stop being excluded from school, stop being stigmatized and labeled as subnormal, and stop accepting that we're a disadvantaged group or that we are subgroup, subnormal, and get up, get into the arena and fight your fight.
I always find G. Bernard so inspiring. So she talked about, to stop the exclusions of Black children happening and stop being labeled as subnormal. So educationally subnormal was a label that was put onto a lot of Black children in the 1960s. And they were often either automatically placed in the lowest sets at school or removed and put into ESN schools, so specialist schools for those who are considered to be mentally defective, which is another phrase they used, or educationally subnormal. So those children, unfortunately, lost their education because you just didn't have, it wasn't academic. The education they got in these subnormal units were really all around behavior and socialization. So this was something which the communities in the Black communities kind of became aware that there was this problem in mainstream education, partly through what they could already observe from children being there was a policy, from 1966 then, to not have too high a percentage of Black children in a particular school, because it was said that the white parents didn't like it, and it was said that it brought down the attainment of the school. So those children were then bused to schools on the outskirts of London, where they were probably wanted even less. There'd be even fewer people that looked like them in these areas. So community realized what was happening. And then in 1971, Bernard Cord who was a teacher here for about a year before returning to Grenada, published the booklet that you see on the left, which is also, copies of this are in our reference library, where he put the statistics by ethnicity of children in these subnormal schools and how they got there and what the teachers in the ESN schools thought, because they often didn't think those children should be there. And so the community came together and formed the Black Parents Movement to raise money for supplementary schools. So the supplementary schools movement really took off, and it was to provide Saturday schools where children could go and learn their heritage alongside learning the curriculum. Within the movement as well, they also did their best to support parents. So they would offer to help parents to write letters or accompany them to parents' evenings, really empower the parents to be the advocates for their children. And a lot of Black women also became teachers so that they could be the change that they wanted to see. And we have one oral history where a lady said when she went into the classroom, the kids looked at her and said, are you a real teacher, miss? Because they'd never seen a Black teacher or thought that somebody Black could be a teacher. So that was like, a very important moment for those children. But of course, as great as supplementary schools are and that they exist to this day, they can't solve the problems of the mainstream Monday to Friday. And that's where our founder, Len Garrison, comes into the story. So Len Garrison was from Jamaica, came to England as an 11-year-old boy. So he was a Windrush child, as we say. He went through his entire secondary school education here. And he qualified as a medical photographer, but he must have, I'm assuming then he must have looked back on his own education and thought, well, where can I intervene to make changes for all children? So he did a master's in African and Caribbean history, where he interviewed a lot of members of the Windrush Generation in Nottingham. He also wrote a dissertation on Rastafari, and then he established an education project called the ACER Project, African Caribbean Education Resource. And this was aimed at sharing anti-racist classroom resources with teachers nationally. Started in the late 70s and ended in the late 80s. It was supported by the London Education Authority, did excellent work, but folded because the funding for the London Education Authority was withdrawn under the government we had at the time. So it just points to the fact that education was really the first thing we started with before we even had the idea to gather other material or even have exhibitions or so on. There's a snapshot of some of the material here. The one on the left is a straightforward classroom resource. When you open it up, it gives information for teachers on what they can include. The one in the middle is information for teachers as well about the SUS law, because teachers needed to know what the children were facing on a daily basis that might affect their mood or behavior in school. And then on the right, he started something called the Penmanship Awards, which was creative writing competition for children from 11 to up to, I think the oldest I saw was 21 plus. So every year there'd be an award ceremony in the town hall. And occasionally people do come to us and say, I remember as a child, I was a recipient of that prize and it meant such a lot to me, as a Black girl in school, to have this opportunity and to be recognized. So all of this material is also in our collections. Anybody can come and access it. So after that then, again, as I said, it was just BCA then was just a lot of material being collected, stored in a lockup down a side road where there's a housing estate, so not anywhere at all accessible. But also in 1981, we were visited in the UK by this amazing powerhouse of a woman known as Queen Mother Moore. Her name was Audley Moore, born in Louisiana in 1898. And she had established something in the US. She'd established an arts organization to collect art and artifacts of Africa and the diaspora. And it was at that moment, I believe, that the BCA founders said, we should really be doing this. We need a monument. Len Garrison referred to Black history as being a living, present monument to the past and to ensure that it's there forever. And so they started to collect, and they collected from, as I said, different places, car boot sales, auctions, without, I have to say, any kind of clear collections policy. And you can see from the statement there that the aim was to collect pretty much everything to do with African and African descended people everywhere. And we no longer do that. As I said, it's just the archive material. But I don't like the fact that these objects tend to just sit in our archive without really being engaged with. And that's not because we don't want to engage with them, but we have a lot of work to do on establishing a clear provenance for these items, and also thinking about how do we want to be presenting African items out of context. We don't just want to be following, I guess, the European norms of putting things in a case and people go there and they read about it, but the essence of the thing is completely gone. So there's a lot to be thought about. I guess they call decolonizing the archive or decolonizing ways of presenting material. And so once the decision was made to have the archive, they then had to campaign for it, because not many people wanted to fund community-led initiatives, in particular Black community-led initiatives. So they campaigned, and you can see on the banner on the left, it says, "Let Black history be no mystery." You can see Len Garrison at the back, the one in the glasses. And then they said, say yes to the Somerleyton site. So Somerleyton Road was where they originally wanted the archive to be, which is where it was currently being stored in the lockup. And on this slide on the bottom right, you can see the architectural drawing of the museum and archive that they wanted to have on that site. It's based on a West African compound house. We didn't get that, sadly. We got the building on the top left, which was at the intersection of two busy roads in Brixton. So as a child, I used to walk past and see it and think it was just a bookshop. I think I went in a couple of times, books and a few items in there. I had no idea that there was such an important archive being stored upstairs. And then in the 1990s, we got funding to start to professionalize. And that's when we rented the top floor of Othello Close in Kennington in Lambeth. We got volunteers to come to catalogue the material, to put everything into proper archival boxes, temperature control, and also a reading room where for the first time members of the public could come and access the material. And I did that in 2010 as an MA student, and I thought, oh, this is nice. It'd be nice to work here one day. Lo and behold, it eventually happened in 2019. And finally, we got funding through the Arts Council, Lambeth Council, and Heritage Lottery to renovate our current building, which you see bottom left, which is a Grade 2 listed Georgian building in the heart of Brixton at 1 Windrush Square. And we added the cube-like structure to the right, which is so we could have exhibitions on the ground floor, activating the archives. And the most frequently consulted archive materials are stored above that. And we also have collections off-site. So that's how we then came to be doing what we're doing today. And finally, I just want to end by just showing you some of unfortunately, you can't see the reference numbers at the bottom, but this is just a snapshot of the types of material we have that related to the health campaigns I was talking about. So on the left, we have the Grassroots newspaper, which is a very radical newspaper. And they're talking there about sickle cell, they're talking about birth control, but not necessarily from a female perspective. From a female perspective, you have the newsletters there, or that's just a campaign leaflet about the banning of Depo-Provera. And then on the right was another publication based in Hackney, where they were also talking about sickle cell and other health conditions and all sorts of issues. So all of these, let's say if you wanted to note down the reference numbers, you could come and see for yourselves. But I think in the transfer of this slide, it's become very, very faint at the bottom. So don't worry about that for now. I'll give you a link at the end to the archives department, so they can give you that information. The same with policing. We have two leaflets on the left from the Brixton Defence Campaign. One on the left is a bulletin, and then there's a poster. Again, that's the collection that's housed here at Black Cultural Archives. And we also have press photos as well. So if you're interested in press photography from the time, that can also be accessed here. And also for education, the material I showed you from Len Garrison's collection it's actually called Garrison, the collection. It's Garrison 2 to 15 to 20. So Garrison 2 to 15 to 20. But again, if you look through our catalogue, you'd find that material. And so finally here, the QR codes and the tiny URL would take you to Google Arts and Culture, because Google actually came in and digitized several of our collections. There's a lot not done, but what they did digitize would enable you to see 33 different stories at various topics, and to actually zoom into some of the images. And if you're interested in learning resources, like if any of you are teachers and want learning resources for your classrooms or for your children or for yourselves, you can go to the Black Cultural Archives /learning page. Then you scroll down and we've got resources connected to different topics that you can listen to or download. Or if you just went to Black Cultural Archives collections, then there you can actually see subject guides on the different collections we have, or you can go straight to the catalogue, type in what you're interested in and see what comes up. And then you can book through the archives email to come and look at that material. You know, you don't have to pay, it's all entirely free. You just have to make an appointment, and then you can be in the library and just take your time looking through what you want to look through. So I hope this has been interesting. I know we've had a lot to get through, and there was so much more I would have liked to tell you about. I see there's a couple of comments in the chat, which I hope I can see. Yes. Oh, no, sorry, that's just from Virtual Village Hall, so sharing information with you. But Andrew, if there's any comments or questions that you could either voice or type in the chat for me, that would be great. So we're open Thursday to Sunday as well. I should mention that as well, because I wouldn't like you to turn up on the wrong day. The reason we're open Thursday to Sunday is because Monday to Wednesday we have school groups in here, and some of you may have heard some children shouting because we had a class in here. So we have 2 school groups a day, but the rest of the week we're open to the public to see our exhibitions, and we also have university groups coming in as well. And we have film screenings as well, and occasionally we have like musical evenings. So all sorts of community activities go on here. And a new and vibrant youth forum, which is doing their own producing like digital exhibitions, and they also do a whole takeover in February. So do keep your eye on the socials for the youth forum materials as well. So if there's no questions or comments, I want to thank you all so much for spending the last hour with me. And I am Ayshah Johnston. You can reach me on through the Learning website, actually. The email is learning@bcaheritage.org.uk. So any questions, comments, or if anybody wants to volunteer any knowledge or information, because it's not all about us talking to you, but we're very much aware that our communities are the repositories of knowledge. So we really do want to hear from anybody who wants to share any information or knowledge with us. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much again, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoons.